The wrestler slammed a royal guard right in front of Buckingham Palace, laughing and filming everything on camera. The crowd was shocked, but he had no idea that Ronda Rousey was standing among the spectators. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning light spilled across Buckingham Palace like liquid gold, glinting off the polished gates and illuminating the immaculate cobblestones of the courtyard. The square was alive with sound, the hum of voices in different languages, the rhythmic steps of the guards behind the fence, the high-pitched excitement of children waving miniature Union Jacks. Cameras flashed from every angle, and the scent of roasted nuts and fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cart. It was another perfect London morning, and for the hundreds of tourists gathered behind the barriers, it promised to be one of those memories they would retell for years, the day they saw the changing of the guard. Among the crowd was a man who didn't quite belong. His presence drew attention the way a storm cloud stands out against a clear sky. He was huge, broad-shouldered, towering, wrapped in a black leather jacket that stretched across his muscular frame. Across his chest, the words "No Mercy" were scrawled in bold white letters, cracked and worn from use. His name was Brad Coulter, an American wrestler whose fame had been built on controversy, spectacle, and an almost pathological need to dominate every room he entered. Behind his dark aviator glasses, his eyes were already scanning the scene, calculating where to draw the most attention. A pair of vloggers followed him like shadows, one holding a camera on a stabilizer, the other recording on a phone. Their laughter was nervous, forced. "This'll go viral, man," one of them said, trying to sound confident. Brad grinned, flexing his fingers. "Of course it will," he said. "We'll give these Brits a show they'll never forget." His boots thudded on the pavement as he moved toward the barrier, the crowd parting instinctively to make way for his imposing frame. At first, no one paid him much attention. People assumed he was just another tourist with too much enthusiasm. He stood near the front, resting his heavy forearms on the black metal rail, his gaze fixed on the royal guards in their scarlet tunics and tall bearskin hats. They stood in perfect symmetry, rifles at their sides, motionless despite the noise and the summer heat. To most, it was a symbol of discipline and dignity. To Brad, it looked like a challenge. "These guys are something else," he muttered loudly, enough for nearby onlookers to hear. "They just stand there like dolls. What's the point? You could walk right up and they wouldn't even blink." A few tourists chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to respond. A young couple gave him a sharp look. "It's tradition," the woman said softly, as if that should have been enough to silence him. But Brad only smirked, rolling his shoulders like a boxer before a fight. "Tradition? Sure. Let's see how far that goes." His voice carried across the square, drawing more eyes his way. The camera zoomed in on his face. He knew exactly when to play to the lens. He took a step closer to the barrier, leaning over it, studying the guard nearest to him. The man was young, maybe late 20s, with a narrow, chiseled face and calm blue eyes visible beneath the shadow of the tall black hat. His name was Thomas Avery, though Brad didn't know it. To him, Thomas was just a prop in his next viral moment. Thomas heard the man's taunts but remained perfectly still. His breathing was even, his gaze fixed straight ahead. It was part of his duty, no reaction, no distraction. He could feel the man's presence, the heat of his breath as he leaned closer. But he had been trained for worse. Still, somewhere deep inside, his instincts whispered caution. This wasn't the usual drunk tourist or laughing child. This was someone looking for a fight. "Hey, soldier boy," Brad barked, his accent slicing through the gentle murmur of the crowd. "You alive in there? Or did they program you to stare at walls all day?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the onlookers. Phones rose higher, screens capturing every second. One man in a gray cap muttered under his breath, "Bloody American idiot." Another said, "Someone should stop him before he gets himself arrested." But Brad's grin widened. He could feel the crowd shifting, feel the energy rising. This was the moment he lived for. The heat, the attention, the invisible spotlight burning on his skin. "Look at this," he said, turning to his friends behind the cameras. "He won't even blink. I bet you $10 he wouldn't flinch if I screamed in his face." He turned back to Thomas, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hey, you hearing me, man? Say something." Nothing. Thomas stood firm, the picture of British stoicism. The muscles in his jaw tightened. but his eyes didn't move. Brad stepped even closer to the barrier. His friends whispered anxiously. "Maybe cool it, man," one said. "It's not worth it." Brad didn't listen. "Relax," he said, flashing a grin. "They can't do anything. They're statues." He raised his voice again. "This your idea of a job, huh? Standing around all day pretending to be important? I could take you down in 2 seconds." That was enough to turn several heads. A mother shielded her child's eyes, pulling him back. A man shouted, "Leave him alone." But Brad's grin turned into a sneer. He lived for the tension, the disapproval it fed him. Then in one smooth motion, he placed a boot on the bottom rung of the barrier and climbed over. The gasp from the crowd was collective, sharp, and horrified. The guards on the far end shifted almost imperceptibly, alert. Thomas, still silent, tightened his grip on his rifle. The rule was clear: no reaction unless the line of duty was breached. Brad landed with a heavy step, now inside the space reserved for the Royal Guard. He stood within a few feet of Thomas, his shadow falling across the soldier's polished boots. The camera recorded every second. "Now we're talking," Brad said, pacing slowly around the guard like a predator testing its prey. "Let's see what it takes to make you move." Thomas didn't react. His eyes remained fixed forward. His pulse quickened, but his training held. Brad waved a hand in front of his face. Nothing. He snapped his fingers near his ear. Still nothing. "Man, they really got you programmed, huh?" Brad chuckled, turning toward the crowd. "Watch this, folks. This is what they call discipline." He mimicked a boxer's stance, throwing mock jabs in the air, his boots scraping against the stone. His friends behind the fence looked uneasy, one of them mouthing silently, "Stop." "Come on, give me something," Brad taunted. "Blink, move, prove you're human." Thomas's eyes shifted ever so slightly, so faintly that only Brad noticed. That small flicker was enough to ignite his arrogance. "There it is," he barked triumphantly. "He moved! I knew it!" A low wave of murmurs ran through the crowd. The guards at the gates tensed, prepared to act if things escalated further. Brad took another step forward, close enough that the edge of his jacket brushed the gleaming buttons of the scarlet tunic. His voice dropped to a near growl. "You're not a soldier," he said. "You're a mannequin with a rifle." For a moment, silence blanketed the square. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. The only sound was the steady ticking of a distant clock. Then Brad's voice rose again, brash and reckless. "I bet I can make him move for real." He reached out a hand, pretending to shove the guard's shoulder, but pulled back at the last second, laughing. The tourists began shouting, now real anger, not amusement. "Enough! Get out! This isn't funny!" Brad looked around, triumphant. "Oh, now you all care about rules? You were laughing a second ago." His laughter rang harsh and hollow. Across the square, a few uniformed officers began to move in their direction. But Brad wasn't done. He could feel the adrenaline roaring through his veins, the intoxication of control. He turned back to Thomas. "Fine," he said. "Let's make it quick." And before anyone could stop him, he reached forward and grabbed the front of the guard's tunic, twisting it in his fist. The crowd screamed as he jerked Thomas forward. For a split second, their eyes met. Discipline against chaos, restraint against pride. Brad's muscles coiled like springs. The cameras caught every movement as he set his stance, lifted the guard clean off the ground, and spun his massive frame. The motion was too fast for anyone to intervene. The sound of impact was sharp, brutal, echoing across the courtyard like a crack of thunder. Thomas hit the cobblestones hard, his rifle clattering beside him. His bearskin hat rolled away, coming to rest against the fence. Gasps and shouts filled the air. Someone yelled for the police. Others pushed forward to help. Brad stepped back, chest heaving, grinning like a man who had just won a match. He raised his arms and shouted toward the cameras, "That's how you do it, folks. That's real strength." But no one clapped. No one cheered. The crowd had gone from curiosity to outrage. Parents pulled their children away. Tourists shouted at him. And somewhere, near the edge of the crowd, a woman in a dark jacket and baseball cap had begun moving forward, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on Brad with the calm, razor-sharp focus of someone who'd seen too many men mistake arrogance for power. The morning that had begun in sunlight was now charged with something darker. The echo of that slam hung in the air long after the sound had faded. And with every step the woman took toward the barrier, fate itself seemed to shift direction. For a moment after the impact, the entire square seemed suspended in a frozen tableau. The laughter, the chatter, even the flutter of the flags above the palace gates ceased to exist. It was as though London itself held its breath. The only movement came from the man in the red uniform who now lay motionless on the cobblestones, his arm twisted awkwardly beneath him, his polished boots smeared with gray dust. The sound of his hat rolling across the stones, a soft, hollow scrape, was the only thing that dared break the silence. Then almost at once, noise crashed back like a wave. Screams and gasps rippled through the onlookers. "He's hurt! Someone help him!" shouted a woman near the front. A man in a gray jacket lunged forward but stopped short of crossing the barrier, uncertain of what the rules allowed. Phones shot into the air, recording every angle. The guards at the far end of the courtyard snapped to attention, hands tightening around the barrels of their rifles. Brad Coulter straightened his back, still breathing hard from the exertion. His face glowed with that same smug grin, the grin of a man who believed he had just created another viral triumph. "That's how it's done," he shouted, lifting both arms as though in victory. "Now that's a real show for the tourists." His voice echoed off the palace gates, his laughter deep and raw. The crowd didn't laugh. It moved as a single body, backing away from him, the air thick with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. A young boy clung to his mother's coat, crying quietly. Two older men in suits exchanged grim looks, and one pulled out his phone to call emergency services. Brad's camera crew hesitated on the other side of the barrier, no longer filming with enthusiasm, but rather with fear, aware that what they just captured was no longer entertainment, but evidence. Thomas Avery, the guard, stirred. Pain shot through his shoulder as he tried to push himself up, his left arm refusing to respond. His head throbbed from the impact, his vision blurred. He blinked, forcing focus back into his eyes. Despite the agony coursing through his body, he did not cry out. Instead, he tried to sit upright, his gloved hand pressing against the cold stone for support. Discipline had been drilled into his bones. Even now, his first instinct was to stand, to return to his post, to restore order. A ripple of movement passed through the other guards positioned along the palace fence, but their orders were clear: do not engage unless commanded. Yet every muscle beneath their scarlet tunics was drawn taut with barely contained fury. Through the noise, a new sound began to cut, a firm, steady rhythm of footsteps moving toward the scene. The crowd instinctively parted, and through the gap walked a woman in a dark jacket and cap. Her stride was purposeful, each step measured but filled with an unspoken authority that made people move aside without question. She was not tall, but there was something about her presence that carried weight. Her face was calm, her eyes sharp. Ronda Rousey had been there all along, blending into the crowd, enjoying the quiet anonymity of being a traveler in a foreign city. She had come to London to teach a seminar on self-defense for women the following week, taking the morning off to explore. But what she saw now twisted something deep within her. She had witnessed arrogance many times in her career, fighters who confused strength with cruelty, but rarely in a place so sacred to discipline and respect. Brad didn't notice her at first. He was still boasting, turning toward his friends who now stood pale and silent behind their cameras. "Did you get that?" he barked. "That's gold, man. Look at these people. Never seen anything like it." His words dripped with self-satisfaction. He didn't seem to register the injured soldier being helped by medics who had rushed from the nearby gate, or the horrified expressions around him. Rhonda's gaze flicked to the guard. She could see him trying to sit upright despite the pain, refusing to show weakness. There was blood on his lip and a grimace on his face as medics crouched beside him, one holding his arm steady, another placing a brace around his shoulder. The sight struck her deeply, the image of honor enduring humiliation. "Sir, please stay still," one medic said, his tone gentle but firm. "You might have a fracture." Thomas shook his head weakly. "I can stand," he muttered, trying again to rise. But the medic pressed a hand on his good shoulder. "You've done enough, soldier. Let us help." The crowd murmured with a growing sense of anger. A man shouted from behind the barrier. "That's assault! Arrest him!" Another voice echoed, "He should be locked up!" Brad turned toward them, his grin faltering slightly as he realized the tide of attention was shifting. Not the admiration he expected, but condemnation. "Come on, it was just a joke," he said loudly, raising his hands as though in mock surrender. "The guy's fine. He's a soldier. They train for this stuff, don't they?" His voice carried desperation now, the cracks in his confidence starting to show. Ronda stopped a few feet from him. She studied him carefully, the squared stance, the way his hands balled into fists when challenged, the restless energy in his posture. He was powerful, yes, but undisciplined. His strength was like a wild horse, untamed, dangerous even to itself. "You call that a joke?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting through the noise with precision. Brad turned, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." "You hurt him?" she said simply, nodding toward the guard. "That wasn't a joke. That was an attack." He laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "Lady, you don't know who you're talking to. It was just a little fun. No harm meant." Ronda didn't move, didn't flinch. "You threw him onto stone. You think that's fun?" Brad's grin returned, but this time it was forced. "You a lawyer or something?" "No," she said. "Just someone who's seen your type before." Her tone unsettled him, and the crowd sensed it. People began whispering, phones still raised. Somewhere a voice murmured, Is that Ronda Rousey?" Another whispered back, "No, it can't be. She wouldn't be here." Brad spread his arms, feigning amusement. "Look, I don't need another lecture. The guy's fine. Go mind your business." Ronda took one step closer. Her eyes were steady, her voice unshaken. "My business is respect, and you just stomped on it." For the first time, his bravado faltered. The confident smirk wavered as confusion flickered in his eyes. "You should walk away, lady," he said, lowering his voice. "You don't want to get involved." "I'm already involved," she replied. Behind them, the medics lifted Thomas carefully onto a stretcher. The guard's face was pale, but his chin remained high. He caught Ronda's eye for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange, something unspoken passed between them. A shared understanding that some battles aren't fought for glory, but for dignity. Brad turned back toward the crowd, spreading his arms again as if to reclaim control. "See?" he shouted, forcing a laugh. "Everyone's fine. He's walking it off. Let's all calm down." Ronda didn't let him finish. "You should apologize," she said, her voice firm now. "To him. To everyone here." He looked at her and snorted. "Apologize? For what? They should be thanking me. I made this the most exciting changing of the guard they've ever seen." There was an audible groan from the crowd. Someone yelled, "Disgraceful!" Another, "Get him out of here!" But Brad ignored them, his gaze locked on Ronda, assessing her for the first time as a potential challenger rather than an annoyance. She met his stare without flinching, hands relaxed at her sides, posture balanced. "You think you can teach me manners?" he asked, a mocking lilt creeping back into his voice. Ronda's tone was cool. "No, but I can remind you what consequences look like." The way she said it made several people in the front row instinctively step back, as if they could feel the shift in the air. Brad chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, you've got guts, but you're not my type of opponent." He turned his back as if to dismiss her, but when he glanced again, her stance hadn't changed. The calm in her expression unnerved him. He couldn't name why, but he felt it. A quiet authority, the kind that didn't need shouting to be heard. The medics moved off toward the ambulance with Thomas, and the crowd's attention swung entirely to the confrontation now unfolding between the arrogant wrestler and the composed woman in the cap. The tension that had filled the square moments earlier hadn't dispersed. It had simply shifted focus. Brad squared his shoulders, pointing at her. "You better step back. I don't hit women, but I can make exceptions for mouthy ones." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Several people began recording again, sensing that something inevitable was about to happen. Ronda didn't respond. Her silence was sharper than any retort. She took another step forward, now inside his reach. He smirked, trying to mask his unease. "What are you going to do, tough girl?" he said, leaning down slightly. Her eyes never left his. "Whatever it takes to stop you." He reached out, intending to push her away. Just a small shove, a warning gesture. But the moment his hand touched her arm, the calm in her face vanished, replaced by precision, speed, and purpose. The shift was so sudden, so fluid, that most of the crowd didn't even register it until it was already happening. In that instant, Brad Coulter, the man who had mocked, bragged, and humiliated, was about to learn that strength without respect was nothing more than weakness in disguise. The storm had finally broken, and Ronda Rousey was its center. The air over Buckingham Palace Square had grown heavy, as if even the summer sunlight hesitated to cross into the tension now stretching between them. The medic's van had already pulled away with the injured guard, its siren echoing faintly down the mall. Yet the real storm hadn't passed. It was only changing form. The crowd, restless and murmuring, could feel it, a different kind of anticipation rippling like static through their ranks. Every phone was lifted, every camera pointed toward the towering American wrestler and the quiet woman who refused to back away. Brad Coulter stood planted like a bull before a matador, his pride still intact, though cracks had begun to appear in its surface. His smirk had returned, but it didn't sit as easily as before. He needed to reclaim the crowd, to turn fear and condemnation back into spectacle. To him, this was no longer about the guard, or even the law. It was about proving that he was still in control. "Look, folks," he announced loudly, sweeping an arm toward the stunned onlookers. "It's over. Nobody's hurt, no harm done. Let's all relax." But his voice faltered at the end, because the woman hadn't moved. She was still there, arms loosely at her sides, stance balanced, head slightly tilted as if she were studying him. The calm in her gaze unnerved him more than shouting ever could. There was no fear, no outrage, no hesitation, only certainty. Ronda Rousey said nothing for a moment. Her eyes followed the movement of his chest as he breathed heavily, the way his hands opened and closed, betraying his adrenaline. She could read him as easily as an opponent in the ring, every twitch, every flicker of muscle. He was strong, immensely so, but unrefined. His power came from showmanship and instinct, not control. It was the difference between a fighter and a performer. Finally she spoke, her voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, yet strong enough to slice through the chatter. "You think it's over?" she asked. "You put a man in the hospital." Brad turned toward her, rolling his neck with exaggerated confidence. "Lady, that guy's fine. He'll get a medal or something. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Ronda took a step closer. The crowd murmured, shifting to give them space. "You think hurting someone for attention makes you strong?" He barked a laugh. "Strong? No. Entertaining. You wouldn't get it. You don't look like my audience." "I'm not your audience," she said evenly. "I'm the consequence." Brad blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in her tone. He tried to laugh it off, but the laughter came out strained. "You got jokes. Listen, sweetheart. Why don't you take your moral crusade somewhere else? This is between me and the British police now, not you." Ronda didn't move. Her posture remained neutral, her voice quiet, almost gentle. "No, this is between right and wrong. You don't get to turn cruelty into entertainment." "Cruelty?" He threw up his hands. "It was a demonstration. The guy knew the risk of standing there like a statue. He could have moved if he wanted." Ronda's gaze sharpened. "He didn't move because he had honor. You don't even know what that means." That word honor struck him like a jab he didn't see coming. He scowled, lowering his voice to a growl. "Careful, lady. You don't know who you're talking to." "I don't need to," she said. "I've seen enough men like you to know exactly what comes next." The cameras caught every flicker of expression between them, the faint tension in Ronda's jaw, the tightening of Brad's shoulders. The energy had changed completely now. It was no longer performance but confrontation. The tourists were silent, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. "All right," Brad said finally, stepping forward until only a foot of air separated them. "You really want to do this? You think you can stand here, embarrass me in front of all these people?" "This isn't about embarrassment," Ronda said calmly. "It's about respect." "Respect?" He sneered, spreading his arms. "You want to talk respect? Respect is earned. I've fought in front of thousands, filled arenas, made people cheer my name. What have you done? There was a brief pause, and then a ripple went through the crowd as someone near the back whispered, "That's Ronda Rousey." The words carried forward like wildfire. Heads turned, eyes widened. Brad didn't notice immediately. He was too focused on his speech, too wrapped in his own anger to recognize the sudden shift around him. Ronda met his glare with quiet composure. "You just made your second mistake," she said. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. "The first was attacking that guard," she said. "The second was touching me." Before he could react, she moved not with aggression, but with the precise, economical efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering control. She closed the distance, her movements smooth and deliberate. Brad instinctively raised a hand, meaning to push her back, but she caught his wrist mid-motion, twisting it just enough to make him stumble. He tried to pull free, but her grip was like iron. The shift of her weight was invisible, effortless, and suddenly his balance was gone. The crowd gasped. "What the?" Brad grunted, yanking his arm, but Ronda stepped aside, using his momentum against him. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself before falling. She released him, letting him regain his footing. "That was a warning," she said. For a second, Brad just stared at her. Then laughter erupted from his throat, a loud, almost manic bark that drew nervous chuckles from a few in the crowd. "You think that scared me? You're quick, I'll give you that. But you just made a mistake of your own. You don't start something you can't finish." He dropped into a mock fighting stance, rolling his shoulders, his size and strength radiating raw intimidation. The camera zoomed in. The world seemed to shrink until only the two of them existed inside that ring of tension. Ronda's hand stayed down. "You really don't want to do this." He smirked. "Oh, I do. You need a lesson in humility." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Then I guess we both get to teach today." The next moment stretched thin, almost soundless. A gull passed overhead. The distant chatter of the city faded into nothing. Every eye, every camera, every heartbeat in the square locked onto them. Brad lunged. It wasn't a wild swing. His movements, though heavy, had the precision of a professional athlete. His hand shot out toward her shoulder, aiming to shove her back, assert dominance. But Ronda stepped aside, her foot pivoting, her body twisting just enough to let his energy carry forward. She caught his wrist again and redirected it downward. In one seamless motion, she guided him past her center line, using his mass like a lever. He stumbled, off balance again. The audience gasped louder this time, realizing that the woman wasn't just defending herself, she was dismantling him. Brad growled, frustration replacing confidence. "You got lucky," he barked. "That won't happen again." "Luck has nothing to do with it," Ronda replied, her tone steady. He advanced again, swinging a heavy arm toward her. She ducked beneath it, her movement fluid, elegant, almost too fast for the cameras to capture. When she straightened, her gaze was calm, almost pitying. "Walk away," she said softly. He didn't listen. Pride had blinded him completely now. "You want to make me look weak?" he shouted. "You'll regret that." "I already regret watching you hurt that guard," she said, "but you're about to regret everything else." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd as he lunged again, faster and harder this time, intent on grabbing her. For a split second, his size overwhelmed her smaller frame, but Ronda turned the grip inward, pivoted, and sent him stumbling once more. Her training took over completely, her mind clear, her breathing even. Every movement had purpose. Brad staggered back, disbelief flashing across his face. For the first time in years, someone had made him feel powerless. Around them, the crowd was utterly silent, hanging on every heartbeat. Ronda didn't move to attack again. She stood there waiting, letting him make the next mistake. She could see his pride burning in his eyes, feel the anger pulsing through him like heat. And when he finally charged, headlong and reckless, she knew it was time. The next instant would define them both. The confrontation that had begun as mockery was about to turn into something far more real, a moment when arrogance would meet discipline, when brute strength would collide with controlled precision. As Brad rushed toward her, she centered her balance, eyes steady, muscles relaxed. She didn't need rage or spectacle. What she carried was something much rarer, absolute control. And in that final breath before impact, as his shadow loomed over her, She knew the lesson he was about to learn would stay with him forever. The air in the square thickened into something electric, like the moment before a storm when even the birds go silent. The crowd held its breath. Cameras trembled in countless hands, the faint hum of recording lenses slicing through the stillness. Brad charged, a living wall of muscle and fury, his boots pounding against the cobblestones. But Ronda did not retreat. Her body seemed to relax, shoulders lowering, breath steadying, every motion deliberate, every step calculated. She waited until he was close enough that she could see the sweat gathering at his temple, the fury gleaming in his eyes. When he reached for her, she moved not away, but through him. Her arm slipped under his, her body pivoted, and with a seamless shift of weight, she redirected his momentum. The crowd gasped as the massive wrestler's feet left the ground for a fraction of a second. Then the sound came, a heavy, echoing thud as he hit the stones flat on his back. The noise rolled like thunder, followed by silence so deep it almost rang in the ears. Brad blinked up at the sky, wind knocked clean out of him. He hadn't even processed what had happened. His body had reacted before his mind could. He rolled to his side, pushing himself up with a groan, rage burning away the shock. "You think that's funny?" he spat. "You think you can just throw me like some rag doll?" Ronda stood a few feet away, calm, her hands still lowered. "I didn't throw you," she said softly. "You did that to yourself." Her voice carried, cool and clear. The crowd murmured. Brad's face turned crimson. He pushed himself up fully, the veins in his neck pulsing. The shock was gone now. Only humiliation remained. "You're gonna regret that," he growled, stepping toward her again. "You should stop," she said, her tone unchanged. "You're out of your depth." "Out of my—" He barked a bitter laugh, cutting her off. "You have no idea who I am." Ronda's expression didn't change. "I know exactly what you are." He lunged again, swinging with the weight of a man who had spent his life relying on strength to solve every problem. But Ronda was already moving. She ducked beneath his arm, twisted her body, and caught his wrist as it passed. Her feet pivoted on the stone with surgical precision. The moment his momentum turned against him, she guided it downward, her body folding into the motion like a dancer, completing a practiced step. Brad crashed forward, landing on one knee, his arm wrenched behind him. A sharp cry tore from his throat, not of pain yet, but of disbelief. He had no leverage. She had him locked perfectly. The crowd gasped again. Someone shouted, "She's got him!" Another voice, shaky and incredulous, whispered, "That's Ronda Rousey, isn't it?" "It has to be." Brad tried to twist free, but the harder he pulled, the tighter the hold became. "Let me go!" he roared. Ronda leaned slightly forward, her voice firm but quiet enough that only he could hear. "You wanted to teach someone a lesson," she said. "Now you're learning one." Her tone wasn't mocking. It was steady, almost compassionate, as though she truly pitied him. That infuriated him more than anything else. With a burst of raw strength, he jerked his shoulder, breaking the angle just enough to slip out of her control. He stumbled backward, gasping, his face a mask of rage and shame. "Not bad," Ronda said evenly, watching him recover. "You're stronger than you look." He spat on the ground, shaking his head. "You're gonna eat those words." He came at her again, faster this time, but it didn't matter. She sidestepped, caught his elbow, and drove him off balance. He swung wildly, missing by inches. She deflected, redirected, always in control, her movements smooth as water flowing downhill. Every attempt he made to hit her only led him further into his own downfall. "Stop this," she said once more, but her warning fell on deaf ears. The third time he rushed her, she let him come closer. At the last instant, she pivoted on her heel, caught his arm, and used his own speed to throw him clean over her shoulder. The sound of impact was louder this time. The crowd screamed, phones shaking, people shouting words that blurred into one indistinct roar. Brad's breath left him in a gasp. His pride shattered along with the illusion of his control. He rolled onto his back again, staring up at the woman standing over him. Her shadow fell across his face, sharp and steady in the afternoon light. "Stay down," she said. "It's over." But he couldn't. Not yet. Pride was a poison that refused to release its grip. He pushed himself up once more, his massive frame trembling. "I don't lose to anyone," he hissed, "especially not to you." "Then you've already lost," she replied. He lunged again, slower this time, less certain. His movements had become heavy, desperate. She let him grab her sleeve this time, allowed him to believe he had the upper hand. Then in one controlled movement, she shifted her stance, twisted her body, and brought him down hard. The maneuver was clean, efficient, final. She pinned his arm and pressed her weight into the joint, locking him in a hold he couldn't break. The sound that followed wasn't a cry of pain, but the guttural groan of a man realizing defeat. The crowd erupted in a mix of astonishment and awe. The cameras zoomed in, flashes bursting like fireworks. Ronda's face remained impassive. She leaned down just enough for her words to reach him. "This isn't about winning," she said. "It's about respect. You don't have to understand it now, but you will." Brad struggled once more, but the hold was immovable. His strength meant nothing. His breath came in short bursts, his pride breaking faster than his will. Finally he exhaled, his hand tapping against the stone. "Let go," he growled. "I said, let me go." Ronda released him instantly and stood, stepping back. Brad stayed on the ground for a few seconds, staring at her in disbelief. His chest heaved, his knuckles scraped against the stone. Around him, the crowd began to cheer, not for violence but for justice, for the rare satisfaction of seeing arrogance humbled before grace. She looked down at him, not triumphant, but calm. "You wanted a show," she said quietly. "Now you have one." He glared up at her, panting, but he didn't rise. Not this time. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by something colder, humiliation, and beneath it, a dim flicker of comprehension. Police officers finally pushed through the edge of the crowd, shouting orders. "Step back! Move aside!" Their voices carried authority, restoring order to the chaos. Two of them approached Ronda first, one of them recognizing her almost instantly. "Miss Rousey," he said, his tone both respectful and astonished, "we'll need your statement, please." "Of course," she replied. Her voice was composed, her posture relaxed, though her pulse still beat fast beneath the calm exterior. The officers turned to Brad, who was now sitting up, his head lowered. "Sir, you'll need to come with us." He muttered something incoherent, but didn't resist as they pulled him to his feet and cuffed his hands behind his back. The crowd erupted in applause as the officers led him away. Ronda watched silently. She didn't smile. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a faint sadness for what pride had cost him and what it could have cost someone else. Across the square, the royal guards had resumed their positions. The rhythm of the ceremony began anew, unbroken by the chaos that had unfolded moments earlier. The palace stood unshaken, the flags still waving. Ronda exhaled deeply. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the quiet ache of exhaustion and the deeper weight of reflection. She turned as one of the medics returned to thank her. "The guard's stable," he said. "Broken collarbone, but he's conscious. He asked what happened after we took him." Ronda nodded softly. "Tell him it's handled," she said. "Tell him he didn't fall for nothing." The medic gave her a small, respectful nod before walking away. As the crowd began to disperse, the weight of what had just happened settled over the square. Dozens of videos would soon flood the internet. Headlines would follow. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was the quiet, the heavy, meaningful quiet that comes after a storm has passed. When everyone left, standing knows they've just witnessed something that went far beyond a fight. Ronda stood for a while longer, her gaze fixed on the spot where the guard had fallen, where arrogance had met its reckoning. Then she turned and began walking away, her steps unhurried, her head held high. Behind her, the palace bells began to chime, echoing across the courtyard like the heartbeat of a city that had just remembered what dignity truly meant. The next morning, the world woke up to the echo of what had happened outside Buckingham Palace. The videos taken by tourists spread faster than wildfire, flashing across television screens, phones, and news feeds from London to Los Angeles. Every angle, every sound, every second of the confrontation between Brad Coulter and the Royal Guard was now immortalized online, followed by the shocking moment when Ronda Rousey stepped forward and ended his assault with a precision and grace that left millions speechless. Headlines screamed her name, and yet the tone was far from sensational. It was reverent. Ronda Rousey stops attack on Royal Guard. When strength meets discipline, an American hero in London. The footage played again and again, commentators dissecting every frame. The first part, the Guard's stoic endurance under provocation, sparked outrage across Britain. The second, Ronda's intervention, ignited admiration. The internet was flooded with praise for her, but also with shame and anger directed toward Brad. Every social media platform was filled with condemnation. Former fans who had once cheered his matches now turned their backs on him. Sponsors dropped his name within hours. His channel was demonetized, his contracts revoked, his reputation dismantled faster than any opponent he'd ever faced. Meanwhile, in a quiet hospital room near Westminster, Thomas Avery lay propped up in bed, his shoulder wrapped tightly in bandages. The doctors had confirmed a clean break, painful but treatable. Despite the medication, his mind remained sharp, his thoughts circling endlessly around the moment he'd been slammed into the cobblestones. What stayed with him most wasn't the pain or even the humiliation. It was the image of that woman standing up for him when no one else had. The way she had moved, calm and decisive, without hesitation or anger, just a kind of quiet duty that matched his own. The door opened and one of his commanding officers entered, a tall man with a crisp uniform and the weary look of someone who'd spent the last 24 hours talking to the press. "How's the shoulder?" he asked, his tone softened from its usual strictness. Thomas managed a faint smile. "Hurts less than my pride, sir." The officer chuckled lightly, then grew serious. "You've done well, son. Orders are already being reviewed about how we handle public disturbances. What that man did was criminal. You held your ground, and the whole country saw it." Thomas nodded, staring at the sunlight filtering through the blinds. "I just did my duty." "And she did hers," the officer said quietly, "in her own way." He placed a small envelope on the table beside the bed. "From the palace," or he added, "you'll want to read it later." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. The royal seal gleamed on the parchment, but before he could reach for it, the officer clasped his uninjured shoulder. "Rest up. The world's already taken notice." He turned and left, leaving the room filled with the hum of distant city traffic and the faint chirping of birds outside the window. Across the city, in a modest London hotel, Ronda sat by the window of her room, scrolling through the endless wave of messages flooding her phone. Journalists wanted interviews, talk shows wanted appearances, and countless people had sent words of gratitude and admiration. Yet none of it seemed to hold her attention. What mattered to her was that the Guard was alive, that order had been restored. She hadn't acted for fame or recognition. She had acted because it was the right thing to do. A knock came at the door. Her assistant, a young woman named Mia, entered holding a tablet. "You need to see this," she said softly. Ronda turned, brow raised. On the screen was a news broadcast showing Brad Coulter being escorted by British police through a crowd of reporters. His head was lowered, the once towering figure now reduced to a man trying to shield his face from the cameras. Microphones lunged toward him as journalists shouted questions. "Mr. Coulter, do you have anything to say to the Royal Guard? Was it a stunt gone wrong? Do you regret attacking him?" Brad said nothing. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. The footage cut to a studio where commentators debated his fate. Ronda set the tablet aside. "He'll have to face it," she said quietly. Mia nodded. "The police confirmed assault charges. His legal team is already trying to spin it as a misunderstanding, but it's not working." "Actions don't disappear just because someone calls them a joke," Ronda murmured, "especially not when they hurt someone." Later that afternoon, as she walked through the hotel lobby, people began to recognize her. Some clapped quietly, others offered words of thanks. A security guard near the entrance gave her a small nod of respect. "Ma'am, you did what needed doing," he said. Ronda smiled politely and stepped out into the sunlight. At that same hour, in a holding cell not far from where the incident had taken place, Brad sat on a narrow bench, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. The cell was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent light overhead. The bravado that had once fueled him had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow ache of realization. He thought about the crowd, the cameras, the roar of their disapproval. He thought about the Guard's stillness, about the look in Ronda's eyes before she had taken him down. A police sergeant opened the door, holding a clipboard. "You've got a hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning," he said briskly. "Assaulting a public servant is serious business here. You'll want to get your story straight." Brad didn't answer. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. "It wasn't supposed to go that far?" The sergeant gave him a look halfway between pity and scorn. "It always goes too far when you forget respect," he said, then shut the door again. Night fell over London, and by then the incident had become an international symbol. Talk shows debated the meaning of respect and restraint. British tabloids ran the story on their front pages, juxtaposing the photo of the guard standing tall with the image of Brad in handcuffs. American networks focused on Ronda's involvement, calling her a voice of discipline in an age of spectacle. When asked by reporters for comment, Ronda kept her response simple. "I didn't fight him. I stopped him. There's a difference." The line spread like wildfire, quoted and shared across headlines worldwide. By the end of the week, the British Ministry of Defense issued a public statement thanking Ronda for her courageous and measured intervention. A letter from the royal family followed, expressing gratitude for her composure and respect for the traditions of the guards. Ronda read it alone that night in her hotel room, the royal crest embossed at the top of the page. She folded it carefully and placed it in her bag without a word. In the courtroom days later, Brad Coulter stood before the judge, his shoulders slumped, his once confident expression gone. The prosecutor read out the charges: assault on a public servant, disturbing the peace, and conduct unbecoming in a public setting. The evidence was overwhelming: the videos, the testimonies, the injuries. The judge's voice was calm, his eyes sharp. "Mr. Coulter," he said, "this was not an act of entertainment. It was an assault on a symbol of this nation's dignity. You humiliated a man who could not respond because duty required his silence. You mistook discipline for weakness, and now you must answer for it." Brad's attorney tried to intervene, claiming remorse, misunderstanding, provocation, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "Regret cannot undo what was done," he said. "You have brought shame not only upon yourself, but upon those who believed in you." The courtroom was silent as the sentence was pronounced: 10 months in prison, with no possibility of early release. Brad's head dropped. The cameras flashed, and for the first time, he didn't raise his chin to face them. In the gallery, Thomas Avery sat quietly, his arm still in a sling. He looked at the man who had thrown him to the ground and felt no anger now, only a kind of quiet closure. He stood when the session ended, walking past Ronda, who was there as a witness. Their eyes met briefly. She nodded once, and he returned the gesture, an unspoken acknowledgement between two people who understood duty from different sides of the same coin. When Ronda stepped outside into the brisk London air, reporters crowded around, shouting questions. But she only smiled faintly and said, "Justice did its job." Then she walked away, blending into the flow of the city like a shadow returning to peace. Behind her, the bells of Westminster tolled the hour. In that sound, there was something final, an end to arrogance, a restoration of balance. And though the world would keep talking about the event for weeks, for Ronda, the lesson had already settled into silence. True strength, she knew, never needed to shout. The city moved on, as cities always do. Weeks had passed since the trial, but the echo of that day at Buckingham Palace still lingered like a note that refused to fade. London had returned to its usual rhythm: the hum of buses, the chatter of tourists, the changing of the guards before the palace gates. But now, behind the formality and precision of ceremony, there was something deeper in the air, a quiet awareness of what had happened and what it had meant. Ronda Rousey stood inside a small gym tucked away in South London, its walls lined with worn punching bags and photographs of fighters past and present. The place smelled faintly of sweat and chalk, a scent she had known for most of her life. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, turning the dust in the air into tiny golden flecks. Around her stood a group of young women and a few teenagers, all listening attentively as she demonstrated a defensive stance. Her tone was calm, her movements measured. She didn't shout, didn't dramatize. Her teaching came from simplicity and control. "Strength isn't about hurting," she said, guiding one of the students into position. It's about standing your ground when it matters most. It's the choice between reacting with anger or responding with purpose. The first is easy. The second takes discipline. The girls nodded, their eyes following her as she stepped back. She could see herself in some of them, the uncertainty, the quiet hunger to understand how to be strong without becoming hardened. After class, one of the youngest girls approached her shyly, clutching a water bottle. "Miss Rousey," she said softly, "were you scared when you stopped that man?" Rhonda smiled faintly. "No," she answered, "but I wasn't calm because I'm fearless. I was calm because I knew what I was doing was right. Fear comes when you fight for yourself. Peace comes when you fight for something bigger." The girl smiled, nodded, and ran off to join her friends. Rhonda watched her go, then walked to the far wall where a photograph had been pinned, one she hadn't placed there herself. It was a newspaper clipping showing her in mid-motion, standing over the defeated wrestler, the crowd frozen around them. The headline read, "Discipline over chaos." Someone had scrawled underneath in pen, "Honor always wins." She stared at it for a moment, then smiled quietly. Fame had never interested her much, and yet she understood that sometimes the world needed to see reminders. Proof that power used wisely could still outshine power used recklessly. Across the city, in the barracks near St. James's Park, Thomas Avery stood once again in the crimson uniform of the Royal Guard. His shoulder had healed, though it still ached on cold mornings. The sling was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of duty. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror that morning, he saw more than just a soldier in polished boots and a bearskin hat. He saw the weight of tradition and the quiet pride of having endured. When the call came to attention, he stepped into position, joining his fellow guards as the ceremony began. The rhythm of their boots echoed across the stones, steady, precise, eternal. From the crowd beyond the fence came the same hum of admiration, the same clicking of cameras. Yet somewhere deep down, Thomas sensed that people looked at them differently now, with more understanding, perhaps even reverence. Later that day, a small envelope arrived for him in the barracks mailroom. Inside was a folded note, no return address, only his name written neatly across the front. The message inside was brief. "Respect isn't earned through fear. It's earned through restraint. You showed both. Thank you for your service. R.R." Thomas folded the note carefully, a faint smile touching his lips. He slipped it into his pocket and stood for a long time by the window, watching the city move below. The moment had passed, but the lesson remained, as enduring as the red of his uniform. Elsewhere, in a far different part of London, Brad Coulter sat by the window of his small cell in Wandsworth Prison. The noise of the outside world had been replaced by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of keys clinking on metal doors. His once muscular frame had softened slightly, the swagger stripped away. For the first few weeks, he had been angry at the press, at Rhonda, at the world for turning against him. But as time moved on, that anger began to dull, replaced by something heavier and far more honest. He thought often about that moment before the throw, the stillness in the guard's eyes, the quiet defiance. And then about her, the woman who had stopped him without hatred, without cruelty. She had defeated him completely, yet when she looked at him, there had been no triumph in her face, only clarity. It was that calmness, that control, that haunted him the most. One night, as he sat on his bunk listening to the rain against the narrow window, he whispered aloud to no one in particular, "She wasn't fighting me. She was saving me." The words surprised him, but once spoken, they stayed. Months later, when he finally stepped out of the gates a free man, the cameras were gone, the reporters uninterested. No one cheered. He walked out quietly, a different man than the one who had swaggered into London months before. The fame, the crowds, the illusion of invincibility, all of it had vanished. But somewhere deep inside, a small ember of understanding had begun to glow. Back in her gym, Rhonda received a letter one morning bearing no return address. She opened it and read only 3 words, written in heavy, uneven handwriting. "I understand now." There was no signature. She didn't need one. She folded the paper neatly and placed it beside the letter from the royal family in the same drawer. Both belonged to the same story, the same lesson. That evening, as the sun dipped below the London skyline, she left the gym and walked through the park nearby. The city glowed in the soft light of dusk, the air filled with the mingled sounds of laughter, footsteps, and the distant bells of Westminster. By the gates, a small crowd had gathered to watch the evening ceremony of the guards. Among them was a little girl clutching her mother's hand, her eyes wide with awe as the soldiers passed. "Is this where she stopped the bad man, Mama?" the child asked in a hushed voice. Her mother smiled. "Yes, and she did it without hate. That's the real strength." Rhonda paused as she walked past them, her lips curving into a quiet smile. The breeze lifted her hair, carrying with it the echo of those words, "without hate." That was what she had always believed, though few ever understood it. She continued toward the edge of the square, where the evening light touched the gates in gold. The guards moved in unison, their steps precise, their faces unflinching. Watching them, she felt a deep sense of peace. The world had returned to its order, but it wasn't the same as before. Something had shifted, subtle yet profound. Respect had been restored, not through violence or dominance, but through restraint and courage. As she turned to leave, the bells of the palace tower rang out again, filling the air with their measured, timeless sound. She walked on, her pace steady, her gaze forward, disappearing into the crowd as London carried on around her. The lesson had been taught not just to one man, but to everyone who had witnessed that day. True strength, she knew, was never about the power to strike. It was about the choice not to. If you think this story proved what real strength looks like, hit that subscribe button now. There are more powerful stories coming. Don't miss the next one. And share this video so the world remembers what respect truly means.